Hi everybody, and welcome back to Teachers Talk Money, where I help teachers master their money in order to give back to themselves. Today I'm filming a much more serious video where I'm talking about all of the things in my life that have led to me having some sort of financial trauma. I've wanted to make this video for a really long time because I feel like it highlights parts of my financial story that I haven't really talked in depth about before, other than just sort of mentioning and passing here and there. And every time I see videos like this or read posts like this, it really helps me feel seen in the experiences that I've had and the reason that I have the money mindset I do today. And so I want to be able to do that for you guys as my audience and just share a little bit more about my background and story. But it's a hard video to film because it's just difficult to talk about these things in a way that is sensitive and holding space for me and my story while still holding space for especially my parents, who are big features in this story. But I wanted to put it out there anyway because I think it's really, really important, and I've been wanting to share it with you guys for a while. So firstly, I want to say that I think the word trauma can sometimes be over applied, and I'm aware that I may even be over applying it with this video. So in order for this to be productive, I want to share how I am defining trauma for the purposes of this video. When I consider what is and isn't traumatic, I think of either specific incidents or repeated events that change the way that my brain and my body emotionally interpret future events. For example, sometimes in my life, something totally neutral happens, or maybe even something positive happens, but my body and my brain respond in a way that signals danger or stress to me because of things that have happened in my past. So when I'm talking about financial trauma, I am talking about the things that have changed the way that I react to financial events that happen in my life today. Unfortunately, there are a lot of examples of that in my financial life, and I think that that's not uncommon at all. I think that everybody obviously has grown up with certain money beliefs or values that are informed by traumatic incidents or chronic repeated patterns that have changed the way that they think about money. So before I get into more of my story, I do want to have a privilege acknowledgement, because obviously I've had a tumultuous financial upbringing, but I'm still immensely privileged. I definitely worked hard to socially mobilize in my life and very intentionally did that, but I'm fully aware that because I'm white and straight passing and cisgendered, I did not have so many of the obstacles that other people have in doing so. I've also probably avoided a lot of other financial traumas through all of these privileges. The other disclaimer I want to make is that I'm going to talk about my parents a lot in this video, and I just want to be clear that I do not blame my parents for any of the things that I am going to talk about. Every parent makes mistakes and every parent messes up their children, and I definitely held resentment for a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today. So it's not as if I just woke up and was able to forgive my parents for these things, but when I really fully, truly, deeply internalize the fact that my parents did the best they could with what they knew at the time, it helps me let go of a lot of that resentment. The other thing is that my dad is an alcoholic, and I'm going to talk about actions today that he took while he was not sober. If you have any experience with addiction, you probably know that when an addict is actively drinking or using, they can be basically unrecognizable to the person that they are when they're in recovery. So the effects of my dad's drinking will always be with me, and they will always be with my family. But I can hold space for that, and at the same time hold space for the fact that that was more of the addiction happening and doing those actions than it was who my dad actually is today, and who he truly is at his core when he is not in the throes of addiction, so to speak. So let's start by talking about some background. I would say that in my childhood, I grew up with a certain amount of financial privilege. My dad had a stable income. I grew up in a townhouse, and then we moved to like a standalone house. I don't know what it's called. We definitely fit into the definition of house poor in that my parents are actually still working to this day to pay off their mortgage. So we lived in a house and had the privilege of growing up in a house, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they own the house free and clear. In fact, they still don't. But we definitely always had our basic needs met. I always had the sense that things were pretty tight, which makes total sense because I lived in a house with my parents and I'm one of 6 kids, so there were always a lot of mouths to feed, you know, even though we had a stable income, and we did only have that one income because my mom stayed at home to actually homeschool us. And certain things signaled to me that things were tight. We got a lot of hand-me-downs and kind of like lived off of hand-me-downs and buying secondhand a lot growing up. Lots of couponing, lots of buying off-brand things, not having cable TV. It was a very like frugal household, and I think that that was really out of necessity. And I do remember there being anxiety in my house around money. I have a very early memory actually of my parents fighting about money. So I had this overall general sense of this money anxiety, and then there were other small things when I would sort of compare myself to my peers that I definitely noticed that we went without. But again, still totally secure, still very privileged. And I have to say I'm extremely grateful for having this level of privilege during my like early childhood, because I feel like those are really the formative years, you know? I mean, I definitely still got that frugality instilled, I definitely still got that money anxiety instilled, but having that financial security during those really, really important years, I think has probably helped me a lot growing up, because that's so much more crucial when you're a child than when you're older. And my parents did attempt to teach us about money in a pretty general sense. I remember one day we got these little piggy banks and they were split into 3, and the idea was like you would put a third into spending, a third into saving, and a third into tithing, because my family was also religious. I would say we probably did not get that much information after that initial lesson, and it didn't really go that far because we like didn't have an allowance for a long time, and then we had an allowance of $5 a month, which was like nothing, and it just went straight to RuneScape memberships. Comment below if you know what I'm talking about. So that didn't go too far, but that same day that we got those little piggy banks, I remember my parents told us that they had opened a bank account on behalf of each of us, and they had deposited some amount of money. I remember it being like $200 or $300, but I honestly truly do not know the exact amount. So they taught us about the value of like saving, spending, tithing, and they also sort of taught us a little bit about banking and depositing money to save. It wasn't until I was in high school that everything really went south in my family's finances. The biggest trigger of this being that my dad was a functioning alcoholic for many years and eventually lost his job due to his alcoholism when I was 14 or 15. That's when my family fell into real poverty and my sense of security was completely taken away. In terms of like how much money we actually brought in, it's really hairy after this point, because there were times when you know, my dad wasn't working because he was in rehab, and then he would come back and maybe work odd jobs or a minimum wage job, and then he would relapse again or completely leave. And so it's just, I can't really say exactly how much we made in a given year, but during that time my mother started cleaning houses for a living because that's something she had experience doing post high school when she kind of started making money as an adult. So she got back into that, and that was our primary income for those years. Really the saving grace of the entire situation and the reason that we were able to survive was that we qualified for government assistance. It's the only reason we had healthcare. It's the only reason we had food on the table from food stamps. And it's really what allowed us to survive in this period of hardship. But as anyone who has been on government assistance knows, there is a lot of shame and embarrassment that comes with being on government assistance completely unnecessarily, and I absolutely think it's a stigma we should break, but it felt very real at the time. A really good book to read if you're interested in learning more about this, or if this kind of sounds like similar to your experience, is Made by Stephanie Land. This is one of my all-time favorite books. because obviously my mom is a maid and was a maid at the time, and was sort of a single income earner for a lot of periods of time in those couple of years. And this book is the same thing. It's about a single mom who becomes a maid, and she shares her struggles with getting government assistance, getting off of government assistance, trying to find work, and it just was a narrative that really, to me, captured the shame and embarrassment of being on government assistance and how other people will constantly shame you, and also the struggle to use government assistance, because there are thousands of hoops you have to jump through, and the struggle to get off of government assistance, which is most everyone's ultimate goal. Anyway, I digress. So from the trauma of losing our only secure income, I got a real sense of financial insecurity instilled in me. I got a real scarcity mindset instilled in me. And of course, my dad's addiction itself very much added to this. At one point, my dad actually withdrew that $200 or $300 that they had deposited on our behalf from all of our bank accounts while he was like in the throes of addiction and quote unquote drinking away the money. He also took money from my parents' joint bank account in order to fund his drinking, which really, even to this day, has deterred me from ever wanting to have a joint account with a partner, because it certainly felt like, from my mom's perspective, although she had not earned that money, she wanted to use it to support her family, and she was suddenly unable to do that. It was completely gone. And withdrawing the money from myself and my siblings' bank accounts, obviously it was, in the long run, probably a negligible amount of money for us and would not have changed my financial future that much, but it just really drilled in this idea that whatever I have could just be taken away any day. And that is something that I still really struggle with when it comes to building wealth now. And the reason I know this is trauma is because it continually rears its ugly head in my financial life over and over and over again. Much less now that I've worked to build a very healthy financial mindset, but it still happens. When I was starting to, when I was blogging about my money journey and I became debt-free, some of you who have been following me from day one might remember the story where I thought I had been debt-free for a few months, and then I got a bill in the mail for my first payment of a $2,000 loan that I completely forgot I had. Now, the truth of that situation is that I made a mistake that was definitely not smart, but ultimately wouldn't end up affecting my finances that much at all. But my initial reaction to that situation, or in other words, my trauma response to that situation, was basically a shame spiral of negative self-talk and thinking that I really deserved that, and I didn't deserve to be debt-free, and of course I wasn't really debt-free, and of course I was lying unintentionally to my audience. All of the emotions of having the rug pulled out from under me came flooding back in, and I had a full-on episode about it, despite the fact that it really didn't even take me that long to pay it off. I just wiped it out pretty much in the next couple months. Another time that this happened related to being uninsured. At one point in college, for some reason, I couldn't qualify for the government insurance. I don't know what exactly happened, but I think I missed one of the hoops that you have to jump through. And I also could not afford the insurance that would come through my college, which I remember was about $5,000, and I had already taken out my student loans for that year. And so I went uninsured for, I think, almost a year. I remember having the conversation with my roommates about ambulances, and I think if you've been in a situation similar to mine, you already know what I'm talking about. Having the conversation of, if I'm passed out, don't call the ambulance. Try to drive me to the hospital unless it is the most medically emergent, medically dire situation ever. Do not call an ambulance, because I cannot afford to ride in an ambulance. And I just lived like that, just in fear that the worst would happen, that I would get hurt or sick and need medical attention. I also had to go through a lot more to get my birth control, which was the most important preventative measure for my health that I possibly could have at that time. Fortunately, I made it out unscathed. I did not get seriously hurt or injured that year. and I was eventually able to get insured again. But in my second year teaching, I fell and broke my elbow. And my trauma response to that situation was that I had a full-on panic attack about it. Again, the reality of the situation was I got hurt, and I have insurance through my work that will most likely cover all or most of what it takes to get care. And I was so in control of my finances at this point that I could afford to cover part of the care if I needed to. But my trauma response to that situation was completely blaming myself for getting hurt in the first place and having yet another full-on episode where I panicked about going to the doctor to get my broken arm fixed. If any of this sounds ridiculous, it's because it is. When people in the personal finance space talk about taking politics out of personal finance, it makes me enraged because every financial trauma that I went to related to a specific policy issue. If I lived in a country where healthcare was not tied to traditional employment, I would never be financially traumatized by getting hurt or sick. I might be traumatized in other ways, obviously, but the fear of impending unpayable medical debt would never be a thing. Had a policymaker voted away my family's access to welfare, I don't even know what my life would look like at this point or if we would have survived. Had I not been able to get so much financial aid because my family was so poor when I went to college, I don't know if I would have chosen to actually go to college. Or if I had, I would probably still be in pretty crushing student loan debt to this day. And if my parents had had any financial education in public school, my life would probably look a lot different than it does. So people saying to take politics out of personal finance are completely ignorant. The two are and have always been completely interrelated, completely entangled, and inextricable from one another. I actually didn't mean to make this video a soapbox about politics in personal finance, but that is my feeling about it. I think you can probably tell from this video a lot of the ways in which my financial trauma has affected my financial life. I do think that a lot of this feeling of having the rug pulled out from under me, of financial insecurity, is what caused me to want to be so in control of my finances from day one as a professional, and even before that as a college student. So there were certainly lessons to be learned. Not that I'm saying I'm grateful for any of my trauma. I'm not. If I could choose to have generational wealth, I think I would choose that path. I would also say that my financial trauma informs the way I manage my money in a negative way. For example, trying to create my unfrugal mindset has been so difficult when I grew up with frugality, and when that need for cutting costs to the bare minimum was reinforced as I went into poverty. And I think the shame-based thinking that I have and the deep shame spirals I go into when something happens in my financial life, whether it be positive, neutral, or negative, all definitely outweigh the fact that this is probably the stuff that caused me to want to keep a budget. Thank you guys so much for listening to this. If you're at the end of the video, I cannot stress how much I appreciate you. I hope that this video made you feel seen or taught you something that maybe you haven't been aware of before. As always, I could not be more grateful that you guys follow along on these videos each and every week, especially today when I'm making a video that is about something a lot more serious and a lot more personal than what I tend to. Please share a comment below if you related to this at all, or if there's something that you learned. And I hope that you guys have an amazing week. I will see you in the next video. Bye!